So the adversaries to us have been working really hard to distort our history and basically take away our soul. Because our history, the blood of our forefathers, runs through our veins. And that is something that unifies us, makes us strong and proud. And over the last years you saw that they started to take down statues of people of our history. Whether you agree with these historical figures or not, they are still part of our history. But in the end they don't really care about the history behind those statues. They are taking them down simply because they depict white people. And now the statues are replaced with statues of black women, like here in Times Square. But it's not just in New York, also here in Italy they put up a similar statue. And even in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, they put up another statue in 2020, this was, of another black woman. But there is nothing new under the sun. This happened before. It just did not happen in our current nations. But it did happen to the nations that far in the past used to be of us. So I am making this series to make us aware of our history that spans back 6,000 years. I already talked about Syria. Today I want to take a look at Egypt and how Satan in this short season has distorted history, changed and misinterpreted Bible stories to bring this current change about. Our current understanding of Scripture is based in cultural Marxism, humanism and Afrocentrism. They want you to believe that Noah had 3 sons. One was a sub-Saharan African, the one in the middle was an Arab-looking child, and then Japhet was the white child. But this whole idea is based on modern-day demographics. The Bible tells us that Ham had a son named Cush. Cush went to Africa, so Ham must have been black because Africans are black. And then Shem must have looked Arab, because when you look at the Middle East today, they all look Arab. And then of course Japhet was white and he became the father of the Europeans. But in biblical times and history, when they spoke of Africa, they were talking about this northern coastal region. Of course, when for example the book of Jesse speaks about the kings of Africa, they were not talking about King Shaka Zulu. They were talking about the kings in this area. In part 1 I spoke about the Middle East, like Syria, and how Syria was formed by Shemmites, Caucasian son of Noah. And they were not like the modern day Arabs. Here we see ancient statues from Sumer and Mesopotamia, the modern day Middle East. These were the real original Shemmites. Here we see a depiction of a Persian man in 330 before Christ. And we can even go further back. This is a depiction of a 6th century before Christ Persian man. And if you look closely, you see that this was not a modern day Persian or Iranian. We can even go further back to the 3rd millennium in Mesopotamia. This is the face of a Shemite man. So let's leave the Middle East of Shem and let's take a look at Ham. Ham had a son called Mizraim, and he settled in that area we call Egypt. There is this narrative going around that all the Egyptians were all black, all the pharaohs were black because they came off the black Ham, they say. Of course, this is not true. It is true, however, that Egypt became a melting pot. But of course, if you settle down in an area close to where black Africans live, like Nubians, it's going to be inevitable that these people will also enter your land and there will be conflict. Like you see here, a pair of slippers of the pharaoh with Nubian depictions. And it is said that he wore those slippers so he could throttle down his enemies with every step he took. It's the same thing with the United States. The United States borders Mexico. And we now see that many Mexican people live in America. But it doesn't mean that all Americans are Mexican. The oldest mummies found in Egypt have blonde hair, red hair, brown hair. And sometimes we find Nubian mummies because the royalty in the time liked to be buried with their servants because they needed servants in the afterlife. We all know the story of how the Pharaoh wanted to kill all the firstborn babies of the Hebrews. And we know that Moses was a Hebrew. He was a Shemite. So how come that Moses as a baby was put in a basket and found by the Pharaoh's wife, and she raised Moses as one of her own? Now, if the Egyptians were black and the Shemites were white, how come that they never noticed that Moses was not one of them? Of course, they looked the same. These were both Caucasian people. Even though Egypt was established by the Caucasian sons of Noah, there was a mixing going on. You had the Nubians coming in, you had white people with blonde hair, you had white people with black hair, you had already a mixing of races going on. Basically the same thing as modern day America. It started out white, and we have African people living among us, and over time it became to mix more and more, even though America still is majority white ruled, even though that is also, just like in Egypt, gradually changing. Also America is more and more ruled by non-white people. Basically America is modern day Egypt. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had a dream, and Daniel gave an interpretation of that dream and what the dream really meant. It was talking about the kingdom of Babylon that would fall, being taken over by the Medo-Persian Empire, that would fall and being taken over by the kingdom of Greece and later kingdom of Rome. But these were not kingdoms of different races. These were all Adamic nations, Adamic kingdoms, kingdoms that will come from Noah. These were all the nations of the table of nations of Genesis. These were all of the same people. That's why King Alexander was not concerned with sub-Saharan Africa, for example. He was concerned about Egypt, because Egypt was part of the table of nations. It was a kinsman nation, and he took control over it. And King Alexander was from Macedonia. Where is Macedonia? Macedonia is here north of Greece. These were all white Caucasian people. And from that same Macedonia also came Queen Cleopatra. And Cleopatra, coming from a Macedonian family, still understood how important it was not to intermarry with the other peoples of Egypt. They kept it in the family, so to speak. Then the Romans took over, and Cleopatra had a lover from the Romans called Mark Antony. And this is where Rome took over Egypt. And if you notice, also the Roman Empire was not interested in sub-Saharan Africa nor any other far region. Also the Romans were still only concerned with the Adamic world. So according to the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, the empires would fall. The last empire that would fall was the Roman Empire. And we see that happened in the 4th century. And this once so great empire was taken over by other peoples, like for example the Muslim Arab invasions of the 6th, 7th century after Christ. And we see that all these once so great empires became third world nations. So the modern day Egyptian government wants us to believe that they are the true descendants of the ancient Egyptians. And this is Zahi Hawass. He is the leading Egyptologist and he shut down all archaeological sites to the west. They want you to think that we have no history there because they find much evidence that proves that they are not the original Egyptians. So even though Egypt was already multi-ethnic, the big change came in the 7th century when the Arab Muslims invaded the Middle East and North Africa. And the Arabs have destroyed much evidence of our presence there. They scratched out faces, they took off faces from statues. Here is a painting from Jordan, which they found, and you still see that there was a large presence of Caucasian people, even in Jordan. So let's take a look at a DNA test of a modern day Egyptian. But keep in mind that DNA results only tell you that you are from a certain region of a demographics that it is today. So when it says North African, you have DNA from the population who lives the majority there right now. But you see that the Arabs also had sub-Saharan African slaves and they also mixed with them. That's why Arabs are darker. The very word Arab in Hebrew means to become darker. Let's look at the test.